Aquarium shatters, crystal shards explode as neon fish swirl in Ethan's dilated pupils. Zero-G vault drop. A black silhouette hangs by a thread, a bead of sweat hovering mid-frame. Helicopter versus TGV in the tunnel. Rotor blades shriek. Red strobes tear the darkness. Predator and prey racing toward one shared inferno. Those three flashes inject our audience with a triple dose of dread, vertigo, and detonation, the emotional ECG that will drive the next 110 minutes of chaos. In 1996, IMF hotshot Ethan Hunt walks out of a Prague bloodbath as the lone survivor and is instantly branded the mole. To clear his name, he must break into the CIA's deepest vault, outwit the real traitor, and survive a helicopter-train death match beneath the English Channel. The plot spins like a nesting doll, but it orbits one covert proverb: whose back can you really turn yours to? Viewed decades later, this polarizing franchise origin is actually Brian De Palma's dark love letter to the post-Cold War void. When the old order crumbles, trust fragments faster than TNT, and spies are merely insomniacs in nice suits, terrified not of bullets, but of the word identity itself. The film adapts a beloved 60s TV series, yet audaciously converts its sainted leader, Jim Phelps, into the villain, a near-suicidal move in franchise filmmaking. What force drove De Palma and producer star Tom Cruise to risk fan mutiny by torching their own shrine? In this video essay, we'll defuse that ticking creative bomb, wire by wire. Back in the mid-1990s, Hollywood had a problem. Spy movies were out of gas. The Cold War was over, Bond was on ice, and Jack Ryan was stuck in conference rooms. Audiences didn't want another clean-cut patriot. They wanted adrenaline, paranoia, and something that felt like the ground could fall out from under them at any moment. That's when Tom Cruise stepped in, not just as a star, but as the engine behind the movie. He bought the rights to the 1960s TV show Mission Impossible through his own production company, determined to launch a new kind of franchise, one where the action was grounded in deception and trust was the rarest currency of all. Cruise chose Brian De Palma to direct not because De Palma was an action guy. He wasn't, but because he was a master of psychological tension and surveillance aesthetics. De Palma was the guy who knew how to shoot a hallway and make it feel like a trap. He brought with him an almost Hitchcockian obsession with voyeurism, doubles, and betrayal. That's why every frame of this film hums with suspicion. Even the quiet ones feel bugged. The production was a powder keg. The original screenplay went through multiple rewrites, with heavy hitters like David Koepp and Robert Towne hammering out storylines that kept collapsing under their own complexity. In early drafts, the plot was even more labyrinthine, with alternate moles, dead ends, and red herrings that confused test audiences to the brink of madness. One deleted scene involved a fake Ethan mask inside a fake Jim mask. De Palma reportedly called it too meta for 1996. Most controversial of all, though, was the decision to make Jim Phelps, played by Jon Voight, the traitor. In the original series, Phelps was a beacon of leadership. Turning him into a bitter sellout was sacrilege to longtime fans. Several members of the original TV cast refused to endorse the movie, and Peter Graves, the original Phelps, flat out declined to reprise the role when he saw what they'd done to it. Cruise and De Palma knew the backlash was coming. They just didn't care. To them, this betrayal wasn't a gimmick. It was the core thesis. If even your mentor isn't safe, no one is. That spirit of risk carried into the stunts. Cruise insisted on doing the now iconic vault drop himself, suspended by wires, inches from the floor, with his arms flared out like a marionette mid-snap. One take famously failed when his head kept bobbing down too fast. His solution? He stuffed coins in his shoes to counterbalance the fall. It worked. What ended up on screen is one of the most perfectly silent high-tension scenes in modern cinema. The original ending was also much quieter. In one version, Ethan simply exposed Jim during a conversation. No train, no tunnel, no rotor blade ballet of death. But test audiences wanted a finale worthy of the setup. So they wrote, storyboard, and shot the helicopter train sequence with barely weeks to spare, using a mix of green screen, miniatures, and early CG. It was outrageously expensive, dangerously ambitious, and instantly iconic. Looking back, Mission Impossible wasn't just a reboot. It was a demolition job. Cruise and De Palma didn't want to continue the old legacy. They wanted to explode it, then rebuild something darker, sharper, and far more paranoid in its place. They didn't just ask what happens when a mission goes wrong. They asked what happens when the people giving you the mission are lying to your face. This film doesn't just tell a story, it surveils one. Every shot is wired with suspicion. The camera behaves like a spy itself, peering, hiding, closing in. Brian De Palma doesn't direct mission. Impossible so much as bug it. From the opening moments, where a fake execution is captured through a static-filled monitor, we're made complicit in a surveillance state of mind. The screen-within-a-screen motif isn't just stylish, it reminds us that someone is always watching, and that truth is always a performance. Take the legendary CIA vault sequence. This isn't just an action scene, it's a full-blown essay in visual tension. The color palette turns sterile white, the sound drops to surgical silence, and the camera becomes an accomplice. It hovers overhead like an omniscient eye, echoing the vault's own triple-layered security. No heat, no noise, no pressure. When Ethan dangles above the floor, it's not gravity he's fighting, it's the crushing weight of attention. The moment that bead of sweat slips off his glasses, time itself feels like it flinches. And what saves him? Not firepower, not tech, but control. Pure, physiological control. In a genre bloated with gunplay mission, Impossible says the real weapon is composure under observation. But the most chilling lens isn't the one pointed at Ethan, it's the one he points at others. In the final act, when Ethan uses his spy glasses to record Jim's confession, it's not just a clever trick. It's a role reversal. The apprentice turns the lens on the mentor. Trust is weaponized. The camera becomes judge, jury, and executioner. The audience, watching through Ethan's feed, is forced to confront a deeper question. In a world built on deception, is surveillance justice or just a mirror for our own paranoia? Let's talk character. Claire Phelps, often dismissed as a side figure, is actually the film's emotional ghost. Her presence haunts Ethan, not just as Jim's wife, but as the only other person who walked away from the Prague massacre. She never holds a gun, rarely raises her voice, but her silence is thunderous. Is she complicit? Is she trapped? Her half-allegiances and wavering loyalty underscore the film's bleakest point. When trust collapses, ambiguity is the only truth left standing. Then there's Luther Stickle. Introduced as a disavowed hacker with no field experience, he becomes Ethan's quiet counterbalance. While everyone else plays masks and motives, Luther is transparent. That makes him rare, and in a film like this, that makes him valuable. His moral clarity pierces through the film's fog of lies. He's not the muscle or the mastermind. He's the tether to reality, the one guy who still believes in a cause beyond his own skin. Now, let's decode some of the deeper signals baked into the Mycen scene. The Prague sequence is drenched in cathedral shadows and cobblestone gloom, a nod to Cold War aesthetics and a dying empire of secrets. The CIA interiors are all fluorescent sterility, a temple to logic designed to crush emotion. And the Channel Tunnel climax? It's a metal artery between two nations, a symbol of globalization, and the battleground where personal vendetta trumps statecraft. The film's locations aren't backdrops. They're metaphors. Each one says, this isn't just about betrayal, it's about the systems that manufacture it. The final twist of Jim being the mole isn't just a shock, it's a thesis. When the old guard sells out the institution it built, when loyalty is a currency and ideals are expendable, you're not watching a spy thriller. You're watching a slow-motion cultural implosion. At first glance, the plot of Mission Impossible seems like a standard domino trail. Mission goes wrong, hero gets framed, hero clears his name. But watch closely, and you'll notice it's structured less like a straight line and more like a hall of mirrors. Each sequence refracts the previous one, forcing you to question what you thought you knew. Time isn't linear here, it's recursive. Motives shift retroactively. Scenes don't just unfold, they are reinterpreted from the future, backwards. The movie begins after the betrayal. The Prague mission isn't a setup for the story, it is the story, shown in disassembled form. The real narrative engine is memory and reinterpretation. After the mission implodes, Ethan doesn't just react, he rewatches, rewires, replays. He narrates his own theory of betrayal through flashbacks and thought experiments, constructing a reality that might be true, or might be tactical. That makes this one of the few action films built on unreliable narration. Ethan never outright lies to us, but he filters the story through deduction and paranoia. We see what he suspects, what he imagines, what he can't confirm. The result is a structure that folds in on itself. The deeper he digs, the more the past mutates. It's less what happened, and more what does he now believe happened? And in a world of masks, is belief any less dangerous than fact? This recursive tension mirrors De Palma's larger filmography. In Blowout, 1981, a sound engineer uncovers a political assassination through audio manipulation, only to become trapped in layers of deception he can't untangle. In Body Double, 1984, a man witnesses a murder through a telescope, but the more he watches, the less he understands. De Palma doesn't just borrow Hitchcock style, he radicalizes it. Surveillance doesn't bring clarity in his worlds. It invites illusion. That same DNA pulses through Mission Impossible, especially in the iconic moment when Ethan imagines Jim's betrayal in voiceover, yet pretends not to know when face to face. We're watching two timelines collapse into each other, the one Ethan narrates to us, and the one he performs for Jim. It's no accident that masks, both literal and figurative, are central to the film's language. Characters rip them off like shedding skin. But unlike in later entries in the franchise, where masks are often used for punchline reveals, here they feel surgical, almost ritualistic. Each mask peeled away isn't a trick, it's an unspoken admission that no one is ever just one person. In De Palma's hands, identity is a costume we wear for power, and the moment we take off, we risk collapse. One of the more fascinating academic debates around the film involves Claire's final choice. Did she knowingly help Ethan? Was she playing both sides? Or was she simply trying to survive inside a collapsing loyalty structure? Feminist scholars have argued that Claire's role as the quiet betrayer reflects Cold War anxieties about domestic women as sleeper agents, devoted on the surface, destabilizing underneath. Others counter that she's the only person in the film who feels, and that her fatal hesitation is a rare emotional gesture in a world where everyone else is performative. Either way, the script leaves just enough ambiguity to keep her unreadable, a cipher with lashes. Even the score contributes to the structure's slipperiness. Danny Elfman's soundtrack is not the triumphant brass of classic spy scores. It's twitchy, serpentine, pulsing in odd meters. The classic Mission Impossible theme is weaponized, rearranged, deconstructed, sometimes even hidden, like a national anthem fractured by suspicion. In the end, the entire film moves like a con job, with the audience as the mark. We're not just watching Ethan run a long game on the CIA. We're experiencing De Palma's long game on us. And that's the brilliance. When a last frame cuts to black, the real question isn't whether Ethan was innocent. It's whether we ever really knew who anyone was. Strip away the disguises, the vaults, and the helicopters, and what you're left with isn't just a spy thriller. It's a meditation on institutional decay. The most explosive moment in Mission Impossible isn't the train detonation. It's the realization that the very agency meant to protect global security has become indistinguishable from the enemies it claims to fight. When Jim Phelps turns out to be the mole, it's not just a betrayal of Ethan. It's the betrayal of an ideal, the crumbling of a mythology built over decades of Cold War iconography. Jim isn't driven by ideology or revenge. He's not a Bond villain with a doomsday laser. He's just tired, disillusioned, chewed up by a system that treats loyalty like a disposable asset. His monologue about the brass throwing away agents after decades of service isn't a villain speech, it's a resignation letter. And that makes it terrifying. Because in this world, corruption isn't about evil. It's about fatigue, about slow erosion, about the quiet rotting of trust inside bureaucracies too big to care. Ethan, meanwhile, is less a hero than a witness. He's not out to save the world, he's out to survive its contradictions. His arc isn't about courage. It's about clarity. About realizing that in the absence of institutions you can believe in, the only mission left is personal. That's why he doesn't deliver some soaring patriotic speech at the end. He just walks away, carrying the weight of secrets no one will ever thank him for. Zoom out, and the movie becomes less about espionage and more about epistemology. How do we know what's real in a world built on deception? Every layer of the plot functions as a metaphor for institutional opacity. The NOC list, a file of secret identities, becomes a perfect MacGuffin because it's literally a list of what people pretend not to be. That's the game of intelligence work, yes, but it's also the game of politics, PR, religion, and, yes, cinema. We wear masks, we tell stories, and we pray that no one looks too closely. And the stakes aren't just personal, they're cultural. This film came out in 1996, right as the internet was shifting from military protocol to mass medium. Secrets were going digital. Borders were going porous. Institutions were going global. The Cold War was dead, but the machinery of surveillance was metastasizing into something even more abstract. This wasn't just the end of an era. It was the beginning of one where identities could be hacked, loyalty could be bought, and truth could be edited like a video file. That's why the villain isn't a foreign enemy. It's internal rot. It's the slow unthreading of meaning itself. The moment we realize Ethan can only expose Jim by filming him, by turning surveillance back on the surveiller, we're not watching a hero outsmart a traitor. We're watching a system devour itself in recursive paranoia. And in that moment, Mission Impossible stops being a popcorn movie and starts being a parable. Because in real life, too, the villains aren't always obvious. They're the people we once trusted. They're the people who trained us. And when they go rogue, they don't wear black hats or laugh maniacally. They just make quiet decisions, one compromise at a time, until the line between order and chaos disappears. So the question this film dares to ask, quietly, underneath all the explosions, is this. What if the real enemy was never the one you were assigned to fight? What if the real enemy is the assignment itself? By the time Mission Impossible reaches its climax, Ethan clinging to the roof of a train, a helicopter's blades shredding the tunnel behind him, we're no longer watching a fight between good and evil. We're watching a confrontation between two ghosts, the ghost of institutional loyalty and the ghost of individual agency. Jim Phelps is the system incarnate, bloated, bitter, self-justifying. Ethan Hunt is what's left when the system abandons you, adaptable, alone, and perpetually unsure who to trust. This isn't just a character drama. It's a dissection of power. So who really gets crushed under the gears of betrayal? It's not just Ethan. It's everyone who believed in a structure, that the mission would always be right, that the good guys wore IMF badges, that serving meant something. The film's emotional violence hits hardest for those who grew up with the original Mission Impossible series, where Jim Phelps was a paragon of virtue. Turning him into a traitor wasn't just a narrative risk, it was a direct assault on generational memory. And that's what split audiences right down the middle. For older viewers, it felt like sacrilege. For younger ones, it felt prophetic. Because by the mid-1990s, the West was entering a phase of deep institutional doubt. Governments were tangled in scandals. Tech was beginning to outpace regulation. Intelligence failures were becoming more visible, and citizens were realizing that the people in charge weren't always playing by the rules. Mission Impossible caught that wave before it had a name. It wasn't just entertaining us, it was warning us. In this context, Jim's betrayal becomes more than personal. It's systemic. He isn't a rogue element. He's what happens when systems breed cynicism and then act surprised when cynicism bites back. He's the company man who stayed too long, gave too much, and then broke when he realized the house he built never cared about him to begin with. Which brings us to the question of responsibility. Who's to blame for what happens? Jim, obviously. But also the IMF brass, who ran black ops with deniable agents and disposable outcomes. Also Claire, who chose passive complicity. Also the culture that elevates secrecy as strength. In the film's moral framework, guilt isn't binary. It's diffuse. Everyone shares a piece of the fallout. Even Ethan, our protagonist, is not without stain. He survives not by adhering to ethics, but by maneuvering faster than the people trying to trap him. His morality is practical. He protects what's left, himself, Luther, maybe some scraps of truth, but there's no noble stand here. Just exhaustion and resolution. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of the film. The moral center doesn't hold. At no point is there an unquestioned voice of reason. No mentor. No guiding principle. No God's eye view. The only compass we get is, what feels less wrong today? So when Claire dies, shot not by Ethan or the CIA, but by Jim, the man she trusted, we're not just witnessing punishment. We're witnessing the film's final act of moral collapse. She hesitated. She broke rank. And she was erased. In a system this brittle, even doubt becomes a liability. The question then becomes, how do you build anything in the rubble? And the answer the film gives is chilling in its minimalism. You don't. You move. You pivot. You survive. Because in a world where the line between heroes and traitors is drawn in dry erase marker, the only mission left that matters is the one you give yourself. Watch Mission Impossible today, and it doesn't feel like a relic from 1996, it feels like a documentary from tomorrow. The questions it poses about identity, surveillance, and institutional trust haven't just aged well, they've become our daily reality. The movie warned us in metaphor about a world where no one is who they claim to be, everyone is watching everyone else, and the only way to stay safe is to stay hidden. That world is no longer fiction. It's just the internet. Let's start with surveillance. In the film, Ethan is pursued by his own agency. They trace calls, intercept data, and track movements, an omnipresent gaze that can find you anywhere. Sound familiar? Today, every click, location ping, and smart speaker query feeds into algorithms more powerful than anything Langley had in 1996. We live in a CIA vault now, we just call it the cloud. The NOC list, a stolen file of secret agent identities, seemed like an old-school MacGuffin at the time. But now, it reads like a metaphor for data breaches, social engineering, and identity theft. In 2023 alone, over 422 million people had personal information leaked due to system failures and hacks. The question mission, impossible posed, what happens when your identity is compromised by the very system meant to protect it, is no longer speculative. It's standard policy violation. Even the vault sequence with its hypersensitive heat and sound triggers feels like a dry run for modern security culture. Constant biometrics, retina scans, two-factor verification, zero-trust access models. But the film also hints at their futility. All it takes is one committed insider, someone like Jim Phelps, and the whole architecture collapses. We build systems thinking we can out-tech human failure. Mission Impossible reminds us that human failure is the system. Then there's the film's deeper paranoia, that institutions no longer represent the ideals they project. It's a sentiment that defines the post-truth era. Whether we're talking about governments that weaponize misinformation, corporations that pretend to protect users while monetizing their data, or media that packages opinion as news, the result is the same. Trust implodes. Authority is no longer earned, it's performed. And performance is easy to fake. What's more, the culture of masks and disguises that the film literalizes has become our digital default. We all maintain curated versions of ourselves online, avatars, filters, alternate accounts. We spy on others and curate our own narrative in return. Everyone's playing Ethan Hunt now, switching roles, hiding motives, adapting to whatever mission the algorithm spits out next. And what about the train scene, where Ethan risks his life to physically expose a traitor using hidden surveillance? In 1996, that was high drama. Today, it's a TikTok. Whistleblowers record bosses, live streamers expose scams, activists upload abuse in real time. Truth is a file drop away. But unlike in the film, exposure doesn't always lead to justice. Sometimes it just leads to noise, or worse, retaliation. So what must change? The film doesn't offer answers, but it does offer instincts. Trust selectively. Question systems. Adapt quickly. Don't confuse loyalty with morality. And when the mission becomes impossible, not because it's hard, but because it's broken, know when to walk away. And yet, perhaps the film's most urgent message isn't about systems or surveillance. It's about resilience. Ethan is betrayed, hunted, gaslit, and almost killed. But he doesn't snap. He recalibrates. He builds a new team. He doesn't just survive the collapse of the old order. He moves through it, even thrives in its chaos. In a world increasingly defined by instability, that may be the real takeaway. Agility is the new integrity. Not in the sense of being unprincipled, but in being self-defined. When institutions fail you, you write your own code. Once a film crosses into meme territory, it stops being just a movie, it becomes a language. And Mission Impossible has done exactly that. Its imagery, rhythms, and metaphors have been absorbed into pop culture so deeply that even people who haven't seen the film can quote it. Try this. Imagine someone hanging from a ceiling in a black outfit, arms spread, inches from the floor. You just pictured the CIA vault scene. That's not just cinematic memory. That's cultural encoding. The zero-gravity drop became a shorthand for maximum tension under absurd pressure. It's been parroted by everything from Shrek 2 to The Simpsons, from Family Guy to Wallace and Gromit. But parody isn't the death of meaning, it's a sign of resonance. What makes that scene so mimetic isn't just its physicality, it's the existential metaphor beneath it. One false move, one sound, one twitch of emotion, and your world explodes. That's not just a spy problem. That's life in a hyper-surveilled society. More than that, the film inspired a wave of tech thrillers and espionage stories that ditched the suave, tuxedoed archetype and leaned into uncertainty, improvisation, and mental dexterity. Without Mission Impossible, there's no Bourne Identity, number 24, no Mr. Robot. It made room for anxiety-driven heroes in unstable worlds, characters defined not by authority, but by adaptability. And academia took notice. Film scholars frequently cite Mission Impossible as a turning point in the portrayal of information systems on screen. Ethan's use of email aliases, video glasses, and spoof data connections predicted a world where identities were fluid, access was king, and the line between hacker and agent blurred. There are dissertations that frame Ethan as a proto-digital native, a ghost in the system who manipulates architecture and interface rather than brute force. The movie also triggered new thinking about ethics in spy fiction. Unlike Bond, Ethan doesn't seduce his way out of problems or shoot first. He reads, deciphers, listens. His violence is always reactive. His real skill is epistemic. He knows how to navigate uncertainty without letting it consume him. That makes him uniquely modern. In a world of shifting truths, he's not the guy with answers. He's the guy who keeps asking better questions. So where do you go after a film like this? What do you watch if you're drawn to its undercurrents of betrayal, identity, and institutional collapse? Here are 4 lesser-known films that expand its thematic universe. The Conversation, 1974, Dir Francis Ford Coppola. Why? It's the spiritual ancestor of Mission Impossible. A lonely surveillance expert unravels when he realizes he may be complicit in a murder. Same moral ambiguity. Same creeping dread. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, 2011, Dir Tomas Alfredson. Why? A slow-burn Cold War procedural where information is everything and no one can be trusted. If you want less stunts, more rot, this is your masterpiece. 3 Days of the Condor, 1975, Dir Sidney Pollack. Why? A CIA analyst comes back from lunch to find his team assassinated. It's Ethan Hunt without the action gear, just isolation, suspicion, and the sick feeling that the call is always coming from inside the house. The Lives of Others, 2006, Dir Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck. Why? Set in East Germany, it explores how surveillance invades not just space but soul. It's the emotional endgame of the themes Mission flirts with. And for readers looking to dive even deeper into these themes, Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott, how governments use surveillance and categorization to control populations. The Real NOC List. The Spy Who Came In from the Cold by John Le Carre, the anti-glamour spy novel that reshaped the genre with realism and moral ambiguity. Information Doesn't Want to Be Free by Cory Doctorow, on hacking, privacy, and the tension between transparency and control in the digital age. Because at its core mission, Impossible doesn't just want you to thrill. It wants you to think. To ask who's watching you, who you're really working for, and what you'd do if the mission changed while you were already inside. In the closing frames of Mission Impossible, 1996, Ethan Hunt sits alone on a plane. He is offered a new mission, handed in the form of a tape, that will self-destruct. He hesitates. There's no triumph in his face, no certainty. Only calculation, exhaustion, and beneath that, the ghost of a question. Not, can I complete the mission? But, should I accept the mission at all? It's a fitting end to a film that, for all its explosions and espionage, is ultimately about erosion. The erosion of trust, of institutions, of identity itself. But to truly understand how radical Mission Impossible was in its diagnosis, we must rewind the reel 22 years, back to 1974, to a quieter, more intimate thriller with a similar sense of collapse, and a protagonist even more haunted by what he hears than by what he sees. That film is Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation. Where Mission Impossible dramatizes the spectacle of betrayal, The Conversation internalizes it. And yet, both films orbit the same terrifying insight. The more access you have to other people's secrets, the less control you have over your own self. Surveillance doesn't bring safety. It fractures reality. It splits the self. It turns everyone into both watcher and watched, victim and accomplice, ghost and operator. Harry Caul and Ethan Hunt would seem, at first, to be opposites. Harry is quiet, private, and paranoid to the point of invisibility. He's a surveillance technician, a wiretapper hired to record a conversation in a public park. He doesn't carry guns or vault into CIA headquarters. He sits in rooms, splicing tape, obsessing over decibel levels and syllables. He doesn't want to know what the conversation is about. He just wants to do the job. But that's the trap. And it's the same one Ethan falls into. Ethan begins as a cog in the IMF machine. He believes in the mission. He believes in the chain of command. He follows orders, trusts the system, and assumes that information, once gathered, will be used for the greater good. That's why the Prague mission shatters him. It's not the deaths. It's not even the betrayal. It's the realization that he has no vantage point, no God's eye view. The institution he served sees him as expendable, replaceable, and worse, guilty until proven innocent. Harry Cole reaches the same realization but from the inside out. When he finally deciphers the tape he's made, when he realizes that his surveillance may have facilitated a murder, he unravels. Not because someone betrayed him, but because the very idea of not knowing what his tools were being used for was itself a form of betrayal. Self-betrayal. Both men confront the same abyss. You are not in control. Not of the narrative. Not of the tools. Not of the truth. Mission Impossible is driven by motion. The plot leaps from city to city, train to helicopter, mask to mask. But its most iconic moment is the quietest. Ethan hovering over the CIA vault floor, arms outstretched, mouth sealed shut, afraid to let a single droplet hit the ground. Silence becomes violence. In the conversation, that relationship is reversed. The entire film is filled with sound, footsteps, traffic, conversations, tape hiss. But it's that noise that breeds paranoia. The more Harry hears, the less he understands. The key moment in the tape, "He'd kill us if he got the chance," is a semantic landmine. Harry's entire interpretation of the conversation hinges on how the phrase is emphasized. Did the speaker mean he would kill us as in a threat? Or he wouldn't kill us, but something in the intonation makes it ambiguous? Coppola uses audio like De Palma uses cameras to destabilize certainty. We think we know what we're watching. We think we know what we're hearing. But what if interpretation is the final betrayal? In both films, the truth is not in the data. It's in how we digest it. And that digestion is always personal, always fallible. Surveillance doesn't offer revelation. It offers ambiguity. It multiplies possibilities. It traps the operator in an endless loop of doubt. Ethan, like Harry, eventually realizes that the only way to survive is to act, not on certainty, but on instinct. By the final scenes of both films, the protagonists have become reflections of the very systems they were trained to navigate. Ethan now spies on his spy master. Harry tears his own apartment apart looking for the bug he's convinced must be there. They've absorbed the logic of the institutions that betrayed them. This is the deepest wound of systemic surveillance. It doesn't just watch you. It teaches you to watch yourself, to doubt yourself, to segment your identity into what can be shown and what must be hidden. Both films ask, at what point does secrecy stop being a tool and start being prison? And the answer, chillingly, is too late to tell. By the time you realize you're inside the feedback loop, you've already become part of the machine. When the conversation was released in 1974, it felt like a Watergate prophecy. Nixon had just resigned. The public was grappling with the revelation that their government had spied on them, lied to them, and leveraged paranoia as policy. The film wasn't just a thriller, it was a cultural autopsy. When Mission Impossible arrived in 1996, the political moment had changed, but the rot remained. The Cold War was over, but its mechanisms were alive and well. De Palma didn't just update the spy genre, he exposed its hollow core. The mask had no face beneath it. The mission had no clear objective. The truth had no handler. And now, nearly 3 decades later, the parallels between the two films feel more urgent than ever. In a world of deepfakes, data harvesting, government overreach, and surveillance capitalism, we're all Ethan Hunt. We're all Harry Cole. And we all live in rooms we fear might be bugged, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally. Our devices track us. Our social media curates us. Our apps predict us. And somewhere deep in the cloud, a conversation is being stored that we didn't know we were having. So what is the mission now? For Ethan, it's survival. Not just of the body, but of the self. To remain intact under pressure. To remember who he is when everyone around him is wearing a different face. For Harry, the mission fails. He ends the film stripped of everything: security, identity, clarity. The final shot shows him alone in his apartment, reduced to a man with a saxophone, surrounded by the wreckage of his own suspicion. But for us, the viewers, the mission is this: to watch closely, to listen carefully, to resist the lie that more information equals more truth. To understand that every system, be it state, algorithm, or institution, is only as moral as the people inside it. And to remember that when the line between hunter and hunted dissolves, the only real act of resistance is to know yourself better than they do. Because that, in the end, is the lesson both films offer. Whether you're dangling over a pressure floor or rewinding a whispered confession in your head, the question isn't what you're seeing. It's what you're becoming while you see it. equals 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 equals. Zero heat, zero sound, zero pressure. That's what Ethan Hunt needed to survive the vault. But it might as well be the moral conditions required to survive the modern world. Near the end of the film, Ethan hears Jim Phelps justify his betrayal. The brass betrayed us. The mission betrayed us. But what if we flip that line? What if he betrayed the mission? What if the mission never existed to protect him in the first place, but only to use him? Suddenly, the whole story reshapes. The truth is not a file. It's not a face behind a mask. It's a variable in an equation where trust, power, and narrative are constantly rewritten. So here's the thought experiment. What if Jim had never been unmasked? What if Ethan had chosen to look the other way, to preserve the illusion of order, to keep the system intact even as it corroded inside? Would that have made him a better spy? Or just a more loyal tool? Mission Impossible forces us into those uncomfortable hypotheticals, the same way Ethan is forced to dangle over an alarm floor, knowing that gravity, like truth, waits for no one. It's not a story about solving the puzzle. It's a story about surviving the puzzle once you realize it was designed to break you. That's why the film ends not with a triumphant return, but with a quiet question. Does Ethan want another mission? He hesitates. Then he listens. And in that silence is a world of fatigue, calculation, and the chilling realization that trust is no longer a virtue. It's a liability. Now, let's dig up a small cinematic Easter egg before we go.